Thanks for tuning in to Magnolia's audio blog. Let's get started with today's topic right away. How does your digital experience infrastructure keep up with constant change? Let's take a step back from the technology and look at the bigger picture so your DXP can live long and prosper. Over the course of the decades I spent working on digital projects, I've come up with several rules of thumb. Some of them are mere observations, some are good advice, some are inconvenient truths. Probably most annoying of these is this. The lifespan of your DX implementation is about 3 years. This is not what anyone wants to hear when they're investing heavily in a complete replatforming, spending a lot of time and effort into finally, once and for all, getting it right this time. Replatforming is costly, as well as resource and time intensive. Definitely not something you'd want to do every 3 years. So how do you break out of that cycle? I could write a book about the reasons, and I just might. But let's tackle some of the bigger ones. Revolution versus evolution. First of all, before you say, it wasn't in our case, I concede it's not always exactly 3 years to the dot. I've seen it happen after 6 months, when it became obvious the new platform was untenably expensive to run, and as much as 12 years, when the inertia of the organization was finally overcome to make the change. But generally, after about 3 years, the idea sets in that things need to be done differently. There are many reasons for this. I summarize it as revolution versus evolution. Sometimes you can't avoid replatforming your entire digital experience, but you really want to be evolving it continuously instead. Replatforming is disruptive, and not in a good way. Therefore, if you're experienced and have gone through several rounds of replatforming, flexibility will be high up on your wish list. You know digital experience is a moving target, so you'll want to have the ability to evolve the platform as requirements shift. One common solution to this is future-proofing. But since none of us have a fully functional crystal ball, there really is no such thing. Future-proofing is an exercise in boiling the ocean, adding in everything you might one day need. The looming danger is that this becomes scope creep on steroids and drags out your replatforming for years. What we actually need to do is to build for change and embrace the unknown. But that's easier said than done. Building for change. If you talk to an architect about future-proofing or building for change, the conversation is likely to go in either of these directions. Automated deployments, CI/CD, and configuration management. Breaking down monoliths into microservices. When I think of a monolith, it looks like the one in 2001 A Space Odyssey. A black, oblong, impossible to see inside, so dark no light seems to reflect from it, the ultimate black box. If you're trying to analyze one in order to replace it with a more modern architecture, you should look up the scene from the movie where the monolith on the moon is being investigated. It will be eerily familiar. By contrast, it's important to keep in mind that a modern digital experience infrastructure is never just one system. Even my personal blog, running the bare bones minimum to operate it, uses about a dozen different services. If you're using a DXP that claims to cover all areas, that's a monolith, but one where you'll want to extend it functionally. A DXP infrastructure is never one monolith. It's Stonehenge. But if you're focusing on one rock only, you'd never get the bigger picture. Functional services. Most organizations can't afford to build their entire DX stack from the ground up. The answer to the build versus buy question is both. It's about buying intelligently and then building the integrations. Unfortunately, this comes at a cost, since you don't get to dictate how the services you buy are actually built. In many cases, it won't even be about how to deploy all the services. Many of them will in fact be black boxes that you don't even run on your own infrastructure. So, when I say services in this context, I'm not talking about microservices. I don't even mean macroservices, also known as the revenge of the monolith. This isn't really about a service mesh, messaging queues, or API gateways. That's not to say that these things don't matter. They very much do, especially when you're building extensive integrations. However, some of the most fundamental issues in your DX infrastructure will be with what I tend to call functional services. You'll often see multiple functional services overlap and compete for the same space. For example, will you manage user identities in your DXP, DMP, CRM, or use IAM? Probably in some shape or form, all of them. Do you manage images in a MAM, DAM, PIM, or CMS? It often depends on what kind of business you're in, and so on. The only way to keep track of these is at a functional level. I've often drawn up functional areas diagrams to make the conflicts between functional services more tangible. You'll have to clear a few hurdles first. Tech people will think of it as pseudo-architecture, yet many people on the business side will think it's too technical. But it allows the conversation to address a core topic. What functionality goes where? From which system will we control this information flow?